Good evening and welcome to The Square. Tonight's discussion is going to focus on the reforms of the African Union. Our focus in particular this evening will be on self-financing of the African Union, as well as a look of the African Free Trade Continental Agreement area. And joining us in this particular regard, we are honored to have here with us tonight. Our guest is Dr. Richard Sezibera, who is the Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. Minister Sezibera, very, very happy to have you here this evening.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. My name is Dana Mpisi. I'm part of the Square. Lovely team, the Square panelists, resident panelists. Charles Haba, great to have you here.
Nice to see you, Dana. How are you?
Good.
Good.
I'm also joined by Ephraim and Berna, as always. Great to have you here.
Thank you.
Good. Good. So like we always do at the Square, before we get into the conversation, we'll have a recap, a midweek recap, so to speak. It's only Wednesday, so at the end of the day. But there are very interesting things that have been happening this week, very interesting conferences and other things that have been, I think we'd like to share. Charles, I'll start with you.
One particular thing that's disturbing me. The Rwandan zebras are bleeding. so traffic police or RTDA or City of Kigali or whoever cares to listen woke up in the morning and decided that they needed to repaint the zebra crossings that we have in Rwanda, put a red, big red paintings, which I don't have a problem with. My biggest problem is the closeness to which they are to one another. So, and I just did a quick count from the Ninzi roundabout. If you take the lower road below Presta House, you get to the Convention Center roundabout, and you get to RDB. There are 11 hyperbole.
But aren't there enough people?
I think there are like 100 zebra crossings. But if you think that's not enough, there's two particular zebra crossings that are within 10 meters apart.
So what is your issue exactly?
My issue is whoever did those zebra crossings does not know how a car works. The moment a car leaves a roundabout, it has to accelerate. Stop. So it's a very poorly thought idea.
I'd like to respond to that.
Yes.
Charlie, if you haven't read the vision, we are trying to go green. We don't need cars on the road. So for me, as a pedestrian, I'm happy to walk. And I'm happy that we have zebra crossings that are giving more space for people to walk.
I think another conversation that is not had enough, and I say this from the perspective of now the driver. We do not recognize, at least we recognize pedestrians as road users, but we do not have regulation for them as road users. So when you find pedestrians in the middle of the road and you as the driver are responsible for somebody's poor decision or I would say the lack of following the road rules. And I know for the longest, I know in the West, for example, you find stuff like jaywalking. Now, jaywalking is simply crossing the road where you should not be crossing it. Coming down to now the fact that we have zebra crossings that particularly have regulation in tandem that says you as a pedestrian, if you cross the road at the wrong place, if you are walking in the middle of the road, you will be fined and held accountable. And until we have such systems in place, I feel like whether the zebra crossings are 10 meters apart or 100 meters apart or they are 20 or 100, at the end of the day, this is meant to protect the road user. And if the road user is not protected from the perspective of regulating them, then it's worth...
Just very quickly, before I get to Bernard, to give a weekly recap, a midweek recap. In the US, jaywalking, it correlates with actually lighting, with traffic lights.
Yeah.
So the reason you jaywalk is that it tells you not to walk, and you walk. Here it's different. We're just talking about zebra crossing. So maybe these are things
that need to be factored into. Exactly. But
they're very beautiful, though. Bernard?
Yeah, they are. I read this story about Kenyan teenagers who were almost arrested at the marriage stops centers trying to get contraceptives, I think a jab or something. And it's interesting because we are struggling with teenage pregnancies, and then in some other country you have teenagers rushing to get contraception. That is an irony. I don't have an answer for it, but I thought that was quite interesting.
Afrin?
Quickly, I just want to talk about, we had 2 incidences in Kigali around suicide. Actually, there was a third one around an attempt. 2 of them actually from a university.
Wow. This week?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think we did a show on mental health, and it was really emphasized that we need to find better ways of engaging one another, especially when it comes to this aspect of health. And I think it was just a reiteration. Like these, for example, the ones of the university, these are young kids. They're probably going through some sort of pressure, either personal or school or both, and they saw taking their lives as an option. And obviously one questions, what are we doing to actually engage these young people to ensure that despite the stress and the hurdles of going through school, they're able to overcome some of these things.
That's very sad.
Yeah.
Honorable Minister, is there a midweek recap you'd like to share with the Square?
No, I was struck by the fact that Charlie is not, is a bit concerned by the zebra crossings, I think. But the discussion, that shows you how this country reforms quickly, looking for efficiencies, effectiveness, and so on and so forth. And these reforms that are ongoing in all spheres, at all times, involving all kinds of people, is a feature, I think, of our country. And so provides food for discussions and thought, but also moves the country forward.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So I think we are going to get into the thick of things. We are here discussing the African Union reforms. There was an extraordinary session of the African Union Summit that took place in Addis Ababa last week. Key reforms were made, but at the same time tonight we really want to focus on 2 things: self-financing of the AU and its operations across the continent, as well as the AfCFTA, the Continental Free Trade Area, and whether this can be a reality, at least in our lifetime, so to speak. So my first changes that were discussed last week, especially for the year 2021. And I just want you, if you can, before we focus on the 2 key points this evening, I wanted to ask you a question on this particular topic. And this 11th extraordinary session of the AU in Addis reflected, amongst other things, and I'll just read them. 1, trimming down of the AU Commission members and adding new portfolio to the commissions. I think they were trimmed down to around 8, if I'm not mistaken. And then the second thing that also caught our attention was gender parity across the board on the chairperson level as well as commissioner levels. So if you can just briefly give us a summary and a recap on these changes and the expected impact. What was the rationale as well as the impact for these changes of the Commission?
Thank you. I'll do that. But can I begin a little bit with the philosophy behind the reforms?
Yes.
Because it's a coherent whole. The philosophy is about, first of all, defining priorities for the African continent and reducing them to those priorities that are of a continental nature, and leaving the rest to regional economic bodies and member states. So, for example, the priorities now are around peace and security, economic development and trade, issues to deal with. So there's that vision. And then the second is aligning the institutions of the African Union with that vision and those priorities. And that's where to reform the Commission, make it lean, fit for purpose. That also goes for other institutions. And the third is to self-finance our union, because whatever agenda you develop, you must be able to finance it and be self-sufficient. And finally, it's how to manage all these, the priorities themselves, the financing, the institutions, how do you manage them effectively, efficiently, so that they can deliver on time and deliver what we want. So that's the philosophy behind the reforms. A number of those reforms were agreed about a year ago. At this particular summit, one of the key reforms agreed was reduced from the current 10, chairman, vice chairman, and 8 commissioners to chairman, vice chairman, 6 commissioners, so a reduction by 2. a bit of a reconfiguring of the portfolios themselves to bring in coherence. For example, peace, political affairs, which is a standalone department now, has been merged with peace and security. A few departments of the future were introduced: blue economy, natural resources, mining, and so on. So there was a bit of rationalization. And second, to your point, is the determination to have gender parity at all levels, 50% women, all levels of all institutions, but also a 35% quota for the youth, because we want to build a union of the future, not a union of the past or of the present, and the youth play an important role in the future. And finally, there was a discussion, a change, a reform of the modes of selection of these commissioners to make the process both country-owned, member state-owned, and so it begins with nomination by the regions, but also bring in competition through the involvement of an eminent panel of Africans that will be composed of maybe of former heads of state and so on, assisted by an independent firm, an independent African firm that will scrutinize the candidates, question them about their capacities, capabilities, assess them before they finally get elected, either by the Assembly of Heads of State for the President and Vice President, or the Council of Ministers for the rest of the commissioners. So continue a bit of membership, member-owned process, but that's of the reforms.
Interesting. Yes.
I think my mainly around the peace and security in relation to the heart of the reforms. You know, we see that, or at least the way I want to understand it, we see that some of the insecurities that exist, at least on the continent, I'll take, for example, within our own bloc, which is the East African Community, which you also had a chance of being at the head of.
A long time ago.
A long time ago. we have the insecurity that some of our nations face within the community stems from relationships within the community. And I'm just curious to know what can we expect from the reforms in relation to peace and security in relation to that particular issue, where you have two neighboring countries that are not seeing eye to eye, and it's causing issues amongst themselves.
One of the reforms that will be coming before the next summit in 2019 is reform of the AU Peace and Security Council, which is really the repository of our peace and security architecture. So that is being discussed. The reforms are not yet complete. They will be. And that's one of the next items on the agenda. But in a broad sense, to respond to your question, if you look at the insecurity within our countries now, they mainly are not interstate conflicts. They are conflicts that emanate from deficits in governance within countries, by and large, or insecurity brought in by armed groups of an ideological nature bent, whether they be the genocidal groups operating in our own immediate region, or those of fundamentalist religious groups operating in the Sahel and other areas. And to deal with this, we need, first of all, to integrate more, but also reform the manner in which we work collectively so that we can both fight together against those threats, our fight against those threats together.
But what about in situations where, and we know that there's politics in security. So you find some of these fundamental groups are sponsored by the neighbor of X, or this particular group that is within the country that is not particularly, that is causing this insecurity in a particular nation, and could be of that same nation, is being funded by or supported or funneled equipment, arms by a neighboring country. In such situations, how then do we then draw the line to ensure that the council remains objective and free of politics?
No, you cannot remove politics from the African Union. It is the political organization par excellence, so you can't remove politics from it. I guess there are two things which may be pertinent to your question about these current reforms. One of them was reform of the African peer review mechanism, which is a voluntary mechanism that states get in and they are assessed an independent body on their own internal governance, including their security architecture and how that works, and how that also relates to their neighbors or not. So this organization has been reformed, mainstreamed. It now has a few volunteer countries, of which Rwanda is a member, but we want everybody else to join. And this will be producing a Governance in Africa report that will deal with some of those issues. As to countries sponsoring armed groups across their own borders, it's against the Constitutive Act of the African Union. Many of our countries are in mutual assistance pacts. So in West Africa, which I think has been more effective in this area, ECOWAS plays a very important role in stopping all this, and we hope that other regions can follow suit.
First of all, before I make my comment around what the point Ephraim has been raising, I want to commend Ambassador Dr. Richard Sezibera for having met me in a public place and really put me on the spot and said, Charles, why don't you go back to the media and continue debating? We need people like you. So Diana, it was a very easy walk for you that I came back onto the into a half media hat, courtesy of the good doctor.
And we're happy to
yes. And so the moral of the story really
I never
is...
paid him.
He did not pay me. I found him reading a newspaper at Riders, and the moral of the story is never walk past a stranger reading a newspaper in a car.
Because you never know. It may save your life.
But let me without mincing words, you know.
Please.
And I like the fact that the Ambassador Sezibera has talked about ECOWAS, because they are very deliberate about these things. And I would probably he may not have very straight answers about this. He just said that some of the mechanisms around implementation of the AU reforms have been left to the heads of state level, others to the regional bodies. And this is directly related to the inefficiencies of our regional bodies to address our regional issues. Why should Burundi knock so hard on the door of joining the East African community? They are allowed in, and they decide to shy away, and they decide to call a fellow partner state a hostile nation. And where is the EAC in all this?
Right.
Yeah. And why should we continue to have unfriendly relations with Uganda at a time when we are all supposed to be driving the East African Community agenda? So and this is one thing about diplomats. There's no better diplomat in Rwanda than Ambassador Sezibera, who's done a lot of diplomatic work for this country. The one thing about diplomats is that they are very economical with the truth. At what point will we get when we call a spade, that we are frustrating these regional efforts and therefore will never arrive to glory?
So is your issue with the fact that diplomacy is diplomacy?
No. My issue is
what exactly is your issue?
Yeah. And I will use the ambassador's own words. He said that some of the implementations of the reforms will be left to regional bodies, which regional bodies are toothless. Yes.
Well, first of all, I think in many of these meetings, spades are called spades.
Yes.
And then, but you raise a fundamental question. I think the critical point about these reforms, reforming is one thing, implementing the reforms is another thing, and that's where, and therein lies the challenge. I fully agree with you. All our bodies, including the African Union, have sanctions mechanisms for non-performance. That includes sanctions mechanisms for not meeting your financial obligations, financial and other obligations. The challenge is always how to apply those sanctions on with a defaulting member state when the very basis of integration are the member states. So that's always been a challenge. So part of the reforms that they recently concluded AU summit, for example, is strengthening the sanctions regime against countries that do not meet their financial obligations. Those were passed. And you could see that there's some countries that look for exemptions. But as President Kagame, who is the idea, the whole purpose of sanctions is to sanction, not to exempt. So to answer your question, yes, these reforms must continue. Sanctions are in place, both at the AUC and even within the EAC that you've mentioned. But one must then raise the political will to sanction a defaulting member state, and that is always very, very difficult. Very difficult.
If I can take us to our next question that obviously logically follows what you've been discussing, Honourable Minister, in response to Charles, is the Continental Free Trade Area. As we know right now, out of 55 member states of the African Union, we have 49 signatories. And in order for this CFTA to be adopted, for this treaty to be adopted, it needs ratification of 22 countries. Right now, I think only 12 have ratified it. So my question to you and to the panel at large is, frankly speaking, what are some of these challenges in terms of making the CFTA a reality, starting specifically with the ratification of, and how can we mitigate these shortfalls that prevent us from actually making this a reality with the urgency that President Kagame and always speaks of?
You are right. So far we have about 12 countries that have ratified or expressed the intent to ratify.
Yes.
And we need 22, so that there's a lot of work ahead.
By March.
Yes.
By March 2019.
2019.
Yes.
So it can be done. The big people, and by people I mean mainly leaders, including Parliament, and get them to understand the urgency of these ratifications, in those countries where parliaments have to ratify them. And so the ratification is a political process. Politicians respond to political pressure and calculations. And so I think that most of the leaders want to move the CFTA, but the population must be involved in pushing for these reforms. And what you can do, what youth groups, women's groups, the media, others, private sector can do to push the countries to ratify the CFTA will be important. Some countries are hesitant to ratify. Nigeria is a case in point.
Yes.
Due to pressure from their own private sector, who thinks they can protect themselves against prosperity, because they see CFTA as prosperity.
Yes.
So I think there needs to be a groundswell of support for these reforms, for them to come into effect.
Bernard, is there something you'd like?
The two issues around hostility in the region I think if we take what is happening with the Peace Fund that Dr. Kaberuka is heading, the other element of the Peace Fund is preventive diplomacy. So whether that, going forward, can help to resolve issues within REX, it remains to be seen, but I think we already have an effort there that needs to be encouraged. I wanted to touch a bit on the international scene. I mean, Africa is reforming, but you've been seated with these diplomats. And again, reaffirming what he's saying, I hope you'll not be diplomatic about this. Is there the goodwill to support this reform process? And the reason I'm asking this is because we have seen that when the AU announced the 0.2 levy, the US mission, and again, the US of all countries, the US mission to the African Union put out a statement saying, oh, we are happy that you're coming up with this measure, but we are against the trade measures. So you have something like that. We know what's happening within the continent, the individual countries, the level of independence is lacking. So how is it going to happen? What is the international reaction to this reform process, and what are you doing in preparation of, the kind of hostility that is likely to come? Because again, people who've been financing you have not been doing it for charity. They do it, behind the scenes to push their own agenda. There's a bit of control. So at the AU level, one, is there a common understanding that you're likely to face hostility, and how are you going to, deal with that?
Can I just say, instead of you, it should be we, us.
Yes, thank you.
I agree with you, Dana, especially because
I don't have
the good doctor did challenge us and told us we have to all be part of this. The youth, the media, everyone, the business community. Yes,
absolutely.
Yeah,
thank you very much. No, I think you're right, Bana. Will there be hostility? Of course, there will be hostility. I mean, why should those who supported us and benefited from in the past, who pretended to support us in the past and benefited from our balkanization, why would they support the reforms? They don't, because the more Africa gets united, the more of a challenge it is to them. I mean, if you look at the CFTA, if ratified, and when it comes into force, this will be the biggest free trading bloc by numbers, by numbers in the world. And then that means that Africa begins to now talk, come to the table to negotiate her terms of participation in the global trade and governance architecture. And Africa's assertion necessarily means that we will be occupying somebody's space who's been there. And so I'm not surprised that some people will not support the reforms. The danger which we must guard against, and which is why I was talking about mobilization, is the fact that some of our colleagues on the African continent might be swayed by some of those arguments that come from outside that are couched in terms and fighting for your interests, while they are in fact taking you back, and we must guard against that danger.
And I would love to know, among the sanctions, do you have a framework for these countries that may, be working behind the scenes on bilateral agreements that undermine the continental agenda?
Just to supplement to what Bana is saying, among the sanctions, is there a name and shame, for example?
On the sanctions that were agreed, these were sanctions on financing the union. And they include measures such as exclusion from organs of the union, exclusion from participation, removal of your voice when you are there. So there are quite a number of sanctions that I think are going to be applying in the financial sector, but the philosophy might permeate into other sectors. So no, there's one of the biggest challenges is agreeing on what to do about bilateral deals that that may impede the CFTA. We've not yet agreed. Those discussions are continuing. When you negotiate an agreement, you implement it. There are goodwill provisions, which means you should not do anything that that destroys or contributes to the retardation of the agreement you've signed. And so African countries have signed on to this. We're all part of Agenda 2063. The expectation is that nobody will go and do deals that are against the CFTA. Certainly for East Africa, it cannot and should not happen because we are members of a customs union. And you cannot strike independent deals as a member of the customs union.
We are seeing it happening. I mean, for example, you have Kenya saying, you know, they stand to lose a lot. Again, with Europe, this is already happening. So it's not things that we're just imagining. Rwanda stand by its word, and you don't see other countries really thinking that that's the way to go. You know, so
yeah, but AGOA is not a negotiated deal. See, this is the problem. AGOA is an offer by the United States. It says, I'm going to remove tariffs on goods that come from countries that they select.
Yes.
You don't negotiate the selection of countries. You don't negotiate the selection of the goods. And they can change the rules of the game as they want. This is what they've done. They changed the rules of the game on Rwanda and other countries. So you either take it or leave it. And countries choose and pick from the menu.
Yes.
yeah, but the problem with that is it undermines integration.
And actually,
But,
I want
Ephraim, yes,
to throw a span amongst the works.
Another one.
I mean, that's the whole point.
That's the whole point of this question.
I think for me, so a bit of context to the Nigeria, and the good honorable doctor could correct me, but story goes, the negotiations happened with Nigeria when Buhari was on sick leave. So these conversations were had. Then the honorable President Buhari comes back from his sick leave. He's lobbied by corporate interests.
Yes.
And literally 2 days before Nigeria was supposed to sign, says, look, I have not had enough time to understand this thing. You all have to chill.
And just very quickly, some of those corporate interests were consulted. That's also another...
Which is also another
issue.
But I want to come back to a simple fact around corporate interest. At the end of the day, as much as we may try to talk about women's groups, youth groups, most of the, especially around a trade agreement, the youth don't understand much about this stuff. The women don't understand much about this stuff. The general population don't understand.
Yeah, it's very high voltage.
It's very it's very high level, and it's focused on the people that are actually involved in the trade. And I've said this before during when we talked about this the first time on the square. Most of the corporate interests are foreign interests. Most of the large companies that are involved in inter-Africa trade or will be involved in inter-Africa trade are multinationals owned by corporations headquartered in some of these Western countries. Okay, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. We say where the US comes and says, X, Y, and Z. At the end of the day, even if we put our foot down and we say, no, we're not going to go ahead with this, what's stopping them from giving a grant of $10 billion to an American company to sabotage some of our agendas? And I think for me, at the end of the day, as much as we talk about independence on a political side, and we talk about self-financing from that perspective, what is being done to create independence of our industries, or at least our private sector, from foreign play? And I say this as much as I say this with as much understanding of a globalized world where you cannot stop companies from setting up in your country, but have we taken into consideration that there is that risk and it could actually jeopardize most of the work that we've actually
Honourable
done.
Minister.
Well, I think those were some of the considerations behind the CFTA. Because if you look at the CFTA, the aim is to create a market across the continent, $1 trillion, internal market, remove internal barriers to trade, promote value chains, intra-African value chains, and therefore bring in more people, more small farms into the trading regimes for Africa, enabling us to move away from a reliance on primary products into value addition, processed, semi-processed goods. That's the whole idea of that. And then the second is then to, with the single air transport market, create the possibility for our airspace to also support what is happening on the ground. Yeah. And we are now, and then allow, with the new African passport, the idea is you allow people to move across the continent and get them a buy-in into their own continent that they would otherwise not have. So right now, most people will go to whoever their colonial masters were yesterday, and that's where they feel bonded. But if we then allow free movement of people, that contributes to buy-in, and the African Union is beginning a discussion around the digital Africa, so that we move into the digital space and also become unified. So that is the architecture, and it's precisely to address some of those challenges that you are mentioning. Now, of course, you are only as good as your commitment, and if people can be bought off, that's a challenge.
That's a challenge.
Yeah.
We're going to go for the break very briefly, but we'll be back. Please stay tuned and join the conversation here on The Square as we talk about African Union reforms. We'll be back right after the break.
This here is the oasis of knowledge. A safe, serene haven for those seeking excellence and success. Where the foundations of various disciplines are instilled. A place we know everyone fails at something, but cannot accept not trying again. While at this place, we never stop learning, because the world never stops teaching. Riviera High School, the oasis of knowledge.
Welcome back to The Square. Tonight's discussion is on the AU reforms, and we looked at the continental free trade area. Now we're just going to briefly talk about the financing, self-financing of the African Union, and financial autonomy is a very key aspect of these reforms, Honourable Minister. One of the issues I'd like to ask you with regards to self-financing is the fact that this 0.2 levy was applied to all member states of the African Union, and it has the potential to raise, as official figures state, 1.2 billion, which against the AU budget is significant. And this actually can on external financing. What, in your view, are some of the key, I'm sure there are many, many reasons as to why there's a lackluster reception by African states, but what are some of the key, lack of adoption of members to actually have this levy on all their inputs, external inputs?
Well, can I tell you what they say and then...
And then tell us what you think as
Straight
well.
from the horse's mouth. That would be great.
No, well, some of them say they have problems in their laws and their constitutions, that they cannot impose a levy that goes elsewhere. Difficulties in automatically reducing 0.2% before it's gone into the consolidated treasury, and this is why Dr. Donald Kaberuka and his team have been going around the continent, working with country by country to see what those problems are.
And with finance ministers as well.
With finance ministers, with presidents and prime ministers to say, what are your practical problems? Because all problems can be resolved and can be solved. And so that is work that's ongoing. But this is a new thing. It's not really new because ECOWAS already does it. It's done it for a long time. Yeah. Yes. We tried to do it within the East African community. It wasn't fully understood. So it's not a fully new thing. But countries seem to be beginning to understand the need for it.
Yes, the gains as well.
And also to find a way of, they now understand, for example, in the AU Peace Fund, which was established in 2013, it's only this year that there's some $60.5 million.
Wow.
It will probably hit 100 million in the next few months, and then the target is 400 million. And there's pride in financing our own development.
You know, I get a feeling that sometimes governments need to adjust their modus operandi to be very business oriented. And the ambassador nailed it on the head when he really talked about political will, and that's really the biggest issue that there is. But the political will has to be driven by some level of economic gain. I'd like to give an example of Egypt. Egypt is probably one of the biggest, their manufacturing and their industrial sector in general is one of the biggest benefactors of COMESA. And I remember talking to the former ambassador here, and she told me that 5 years ago when they had just started, the business community had just started the Egypt East Africa Expo. They used to do...
Is it still ongoing?
It's actually increased to about,
Fantastic.
I think they do now 10 of them in the whole region. When they had just started, there was a lot of hesitance. Our leather products and jackets and shoes. But today, with the volume, some of them actually, it's a permanent job for some of the exhibitors because of, by the time they start from one partner, from one East African country and get to the next and finish the last, it's time to get to the next. What does this tell you about the potential that we have for our goods and services if we trade amongst ourselves? So there is a direct benefit to the business community. And I think that is where we're missing the point in as far as this whole AU reform is concerned. We need to see, and that's the drive, the mobilization that Ambassador is talking about. If the focus can be sort of driven a little bit away from political and taken to where it adds a penny into somebody's pocket.
If I can just add
Yes,
to
it will.
to
In
what
my
you're
opinion, it
saying.
will have a bigger impact.
And just
Yes.
for your information, I'm sure Minister will say something about that. I think right now, continentally, the narrative is that, look, political will, governments have been sold into this idea. And continentally, private sector is now the next, the business communities are now, the focus is actually now on business
Aren't we talking about the
communities.
0.2 levy?
Yes.
Because I feel like the 0.2 levy is purely a government decision, unless I'm wrong.
It is,
He can
Of course,
clarify.
the implementing agency is government, but the person whom
it's
it will
private
pain
sector. It's
But-
private
but at the
sector.
end of the day-
is a private
but-
sector. But the point I'm
what is
raising
the
a friend.
point?
My point is, who is responsible for carrying out, you said, so you call it the implementing body.
Yes.
So I'm just
Customs.
curious, at the end of the day, it's the government. So the government is the one that can come in and say, we're imposing the 0.2%. Now, it's also the government's job to explain to the private sector why it's so important. So
Back
my
to
question is,
political will, yes.
exactly, so at the end of the day, the bottleneck is, I would say, the largest, or at least the main bottleneck that's preventing everything from happening is the political will. So he mentions, for example, some countries are like, look, our constitution does not allow us to impose a levy and then take that money elsewhere. Or
Who drafts the constitution?
exactly my
Yes,
point. So the question then comes in is, at the end of the day, who needs to be on board for this?
Just
thing to
very quickly,
succeed?
Ephraim and Charles, and Honorable Minister, I'm just listening to what you're saying. I think political will is there for a fact. It's there.
But are we sure?
I don't
It
agree
is.
with you, Dan.
Well, and that's
Yes,
why I
yes,
want. Fair enough, and that's why I want the Honorable Minister to give his point. I'm very passionate about. I think we all are about this whole continental agenda and this whole narrative. I really feel governments have agenda moving forward. I think political will is there and it's gaining momentum. The focus, I think, now should be on private sector, which is happening, but albeit more should be done to involve private sector stakeholders.
Yeah, I think the political will is there. I mean, the drive for reforms came from the political leaders of the continent. It did not come from the citizenry.
Yes.
And even the request for President Kagame to lead the reforms came from the leaders of the continent who looked around and said, we need to reform the way we are doing business. This is extremely important for Africa and for us, for our own survival. And they requested him to come and lead the reforms. So, yes, I think governments, by and large, have bought in. Now, leadership is at different levels. So you might have political leadership and commitment, and then you have some of the leaders who implement the revenue authorities, the parliaments, the standards bodies, and others who are leaders in their own right, who do not fully follow through quickly. And those must be mobilized. But I think that in the last analysis, the private sector, those who actually do the trade, make trade after trade,
The implementers, the actual implementers.
will be
Yes.
the drivers of this reform. If we can get them on board, it will be much faster. If we don't,
But do you believe that they wouldn't want to be on board? The question I think for me is, who right now is the bottleneck? Because if you told a businessman you're going to make more money, the guy will agree.
yes, but if you say you'll make, if you tell him, if somebody tells him that you'll make more money on condition that Ghana does not make the money in the same sector, they will fight for protectionism. So some of the business leaders will fight for protectionism because they think that's where they make more money, and they hinder the reforms. That's why we need to bring them on board.
Can we just quickly go? I would like us to read, and based on this conversation, the first tweet is from Frank, who says that I hope the AFCFTA is taking lessons from the EU experience, particularly the post-traumatic Brexit stress disorder that is currently ripping through Europe. Minister, what do you have to say to that tweet?
Yes, we're certainly looking at what is happening in Europe and taking lessons from
single
What kind of
currency
lessons? What kind of lessons?
The biggest lesson is that the reforms and African integration can only be sustainable if it is owned by the people, not by the elite. If it's just an elite-driven thing, then we won't go far. I think that is the biggest lesson.
And how would you say that AFCFTA is owned by the people?
It's a work in progress. I think this whole idea of having quotas for women, quotas for youth in leadership is one pillar. The involvement of the attempt to form a Pan-African Business Council is another attempt. The attempt to form a Pan-African Youth Council, which is ongoing. A Pan-African Women's Body. It's also coming.
Still,
into
doesn't
place.
that still have a tone of elitism?
Can you just go to the next tweet and we'll get back to the elitist tone that you're talking about. Our next tweet is from Celestine, and he says, and I think he's talking about the RECs, the regional economic communities. He says reforms are expected to change the instability and bad politics. But I was asking myself, if EAC, which is easily, as in management, have failed, is Africa at a continental level possible?
And just to add that, for most people, when they look at the discussions happening at the AU level, and they go back to the regional blocks and look at the stalemates, the stalled projects, I mean, where should people get the confidence that you can work together?
We
you
can
know,
work, the AU can work. It doesn't belong to the...
but for 50 plus countries, 50 plus countries, where are these mechanisms of making regional economic the RECs more effective?
Which is also
and can we have a regional continental agreement with weak RECs?
No, you cannot. The answer is you cannot have a strong African Union with weak RECs. And that's why part of the reforms is to say, how can the AUC possibilities with these RECs? And there is a summit, the media summit. The African Union used to have 2 summits a year. Now they have, part of the reform is to reduce them to 1 summit per year, and then have the second summit turn into a coordination meeting with RECs, so that people agree, what you RECs, what are you doing in infrastructure, what are you doing in peace and security, how can we help you, how can you do better? So that is a realization of that challenge, which is a real challenge, but the reforms are trying to fix that.
And then there's the last tweet for this evening. The last tweet says that, and it's directly to you, Honourable Minister, in light of the impending Brexit and the UK leaving the EU, could the Ambassador try to explain how the EU reforms will work with African leaders to help them avoid the trap of strengthening their nationalistic sentiments, e.g. economic protectionism, which is what you talked about. So in summary, if you could repeat for Richard's benefit, but I know that's what you've already mentioned.
As an African, I am not bothered by others weakening their own bodies. I think we need, this is the time. This is a unique opportunity for Africa to really come together and drive her own agenda, because other people have their own problems. And therefore, maybe they're less fixated on what we are doing. So this is our chance. I think, as President Kagame said, we have all the tools we need to succeed, and history will not forgive us if we fail. So for me, those who are weakening other blocs and doing things, becoming protectionist, provides us with a chance to look inward into Africa ourselves, and then work together as Africans to occupy the space that they are exiting from.
And I'd just like to echo what you said at the UNECA meeting yesterday, in terms of, in light of this particular tweet, and what you're saying is that, right now there's a conundrum between RECs, regional economic communities, vis-a-vis the continental agenda. And you have this, and you mentioned this, to use your words, you said it's an issue of logic, position and, positioning Rwanda or Uganda, as opposed to actually the logic of positioning and following this continental agenda. And this seamless transition, I think, is something that is a challenge, but like you said, is something that we have to have a mindset to adopt. Very quickly, we need closing remarks. We're left with very few minutes. I'll start with you, Charles.
You start with me. I don't agree with Dr. Seziver. I don't agree with you, Diana, that there is political goodwill. With the exception,
It's not sufficient.
yeah, with the exception of President Kagame and probably a few other like-minded people, we cannot look at the exception and make it the law. For crying out loud, you can't have close to 1 year ago President Cyril Ramaphosa coming to Kigali in front of hundreds of delegates, in front of millions of viewers, and say, consider the issue of visas history. And we're about to celebrate the first anniversary of that statement, and nothing has been done. So I don't feel that there is political goodwill to drive this AU.
Can I add?
remarks.
Yeah, my closing remarks in relation to that.
Yes.
No, I wanted to say that for me, I find that, and coming back to this question of is AFCFT truly owned by the people on the basis of the single skies agenda where people are trying to push for visa-free Africa, on the basis that there's a serious undertone of xenophobia in certain parts of our continent, more particularly in Southern Africa. And we can take, for example, South Africa as a main example, and he has talked about it. Okay. You find that even if the elite, the politicians say, look, we're going to go ahead and allow run-ins to travel and solve these issues, or we're going to do visas on arrival, etc., etc., at the end of the day, the people don't want that. Yeah. So for me, there's that question.
Politically pregnant statements.
Very quickly.
Two things. One on gender parity.
Yes.
I think we should, the next summit, hopefully, we'll see a different picture. Yes. Because the kind of pictures that we see from the AU, oh God, no. You know, something
all
has
the 50
happened.
men in suits,
I know. It's so annoying.
Say thank you.
That has to change. And then two, it would be interesting to see how Africa deals with the pushback.
Yes.
It cannot be underestimated because we're already seeing signs. So how Africa responds to the pushback, it will be interesting to see.
Planning is very important.
Yes, because for a very long time, as Africans, we're very pessimistic around, especially with the AU. Now is the time we're saying, okay, something is finally happening. Whether that is sustainable, it remains to be seen.
Honourable Minister, closing remarks?
Well, I think for the leaders on the continent, they are clear-eyed. They live with the world as is, and they try to change it to what it could be in the future. And this CFTA is a vision, but it also takes a lot of time. Integration is a journey; it's not a marathon. And as long as one keeps onto the road, then we will succeed.
Thank you. I like that optimism. Charles, I think the next show, because I'm in shock that you're saying there's none whatsoever.
It's not sufficient.
It's not sufficient.
Good. Thank you very much, Honourable Minister, for joining us. Ephraim, Bernard, Charles, always a pleasure to have you. Thank you very much for joining us. For you who are watching, going on the AU reforms, the AFCFTA, as well as self-financing. Those were the key issues we discussed this evening. I would like to thank our partners, Uzi Collections and Bourbon Coffee, as always. Please join us next week and have a good evening. Thank you.